So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on decent work and economic growth. This is a discussion around UN Sustainable Development Goal number 8. The webinar will feature Stephen Herzenberg, Executive Director of the Keystone Research Center. Today we'll explore employment and financial inequalities within our society. We'll have specific discussions on areas that include the current state and impact of unemployment, inflation, and income inequality in Pennsylvania. And I just want to introduce myself. I'm Mark Hand, the GreenGov Council Director. And just a really brief background on the GreenGov Council. The GreenGov Council formed in 2019 under Governor Wolf's executive order. And the executive order is around really about it's to support the overall Pennsylvania climate goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 26% by 2025 and then 80% by 2050. And so as GreenGov, we work with state agencies, and the goal for state agencies is to lead by example on a number of performance measures. And so we actively track fleet electrification, high performance buildings, energy reductions throughout the Commonwealth, and use of renewable electricity and as it pertains to our Commonwealth agencies. So please visit our website and we can put that in the chat as we go. And obviously you probably found it if you registered for this event, but we'll make sure to drop that in again. And then other items that we do as GreenGov is we also are working to expand our mission somewhat to incorporate other important areas of sustainability. And we've been doing this with Penn State Sustainability Institute for the last couple of years. And so now I'd like to introduce our friend and colleague and partner at the Penn State Sustainability Institute, Dr. Peter Boger. Peter Boger is an Assistant Director for Community Engagement at Penn State Sustainability Institute. Peter has been instrumental in our GreenGov and Sustainability Institute partnership. We are currently collaborating on our 4th webinar series. The series obviously kicks off today, and thanks for joining us today. And the series will run through spring of 2023. And some of the upcoming webinar topics that after today, in November, on November 10th, we have household carbon reduction and sort of the building sciences connection. That's November 10th. And then in January, we'll skip December, come back in January for sustainability and resilience in community and specifically about food systems, which is an important and I think a popular topic with our audiences in the past. And then in February and March, we'll cover a couple water topics, water resources and resiliency, followed by water justice and sustainable communities in March. And then we'll end in April with land management best practices for ecosystem health and pollinators in April. So Peter, I'll turn the presentation over to you for additional comments and to kick things off with the introduction of our speaker. Thanks.
And thank you, Mark, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. It's a real privilege and pleasure to have this series continuing. This is a partnership that we really value at Penn State. At the Sustainability Institute, where we are at Penn State, we serve as the kind of connector or the catalyst for sustainability across all 24 of Penn State's campuses, trying to work in spaces of research, faculty engagement, student engagement, staff engagement, community engagement, and operations. And obviously, we can't do that alone. So really, we see ourselves as how do we get the people in the room to see that sustainability is all of our jobs, and sustainability is an opportunity for all of us. And working with the GreenGov Council with a similar mission that they have for the state government, we have found to be a great partnership and something we're excited to continue this year. Just quickly mentioning something related to Penn State, I know there are some students from the SMEAL Ethical Leadership program who are attending today, and I will put up the QR code at the end of today's presentation so that you all can sign in and register your attendance. But now it's my great privilege to introduce our speaker for today, Stephen Herzenberg. Stephen Herzenberg is the Executive Director of the Keystone Research Center and holds a PhD in economics from MIT. His research has focused on the US and global auto industry, the rise of the service-dominated new economy, the challenges unions face adapting to the new economy, workforce development, economic development, industry studies, including early childhood education, long-term care, manufacturing and construction, and state policy issues generally. His writings includes The State of Working Pennsylvania, published annually since 1996. He has many other publications, but I think you can just hear just from that brief biography, this is somebody who is perfectly situated to give us an overview of working in Pennsylvania. So Dr. Herzenberg, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Peter and Mark. Let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. Keystone Research Center is a kind of 18-person economic research and policy organization founded in December 1995. We also have something called the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center and the We the People Pennsylvania campaign, and helped start something called the Reimagine Appalachia campaign, which is a 4-state climate project. The talk I'm going to give today draws on two bodies of recent work. One is that a friend of mine who's a lawyer dragooned me, not for the first time, into writing something without compensation for a project he's involved with the Environmental Law Institute. And the project is in a couple different stages, analyzing what could be done to accelerate U.S. progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And the goal that I'm assigned to is Goal 8, decent work. And so the first step in the middle of last year was kind of a series of op-ed length pieces on all 15 Sustainable Development Goals framed as recommendations to the Biden administration. So the PowerPoint, which I'm sure folks can get later from the organizers or directly from me if that ends up being helpful. There's a link there to that document. And then that work continued. The second phase of that work is a book, which has book length treatments of how you make progress on each goal. I think that's the editing process is just about done, so I assume that's going to be coming out probably early next year. And then the second body of work is the report that we've been putting out since 1996, a little before Labor Day, called The State of Working Pennsylvania. There's a link here to the 2022 report, which by our standards was kind of an optimistic take, because we sort of argued that workers actually have been doing a bit better in the last 6 or 7 years, and that at least so far has held up in the pandemic. But over a longer time period, of course, workers have not done well in this country since the late 1970s. So you'll see a bunch of charts drawn from that report in this presentation. But I'm going to frame the discussion, directly around Sustainable Development Goal 8. And oops, let me close that. Okay, good. And so this listed here are kind of all of the major targets related to Sustainable Development Goal 8, decent work. And then a bunch of these are more relevant to developing countries. So the sort of absolute level of growth, which is the first one, is more relevant to a developing country. The U.S. economic pie as a whole is pretty big. So distribution is arguably a more important goal than absolute growth rates. Ending modern slavery, trafficking, and child labor. I'm not contending that those aren't issues in the United States, but they're not as central here as some other parts of the world. Same thing with access to banking, insurance, and financial services. So I've highlighted in yellow the sort of two goals that, in my analysis for the Environmental Law Institute project, that I focused on. And the first one I'll highlight is protecting labor rights and promoting safe working environments. The central argument I'm going to make here is that the U.S. has very weak labor rights, and that's has a more causal influence on the progress we make on decent work targets generally. If we fix that problem, then we can make progress on many of these indicators, and frankly, many of the other sustainable development goals as well. And then the second goal highlighted here is achieve full employment and decent work with equal pay, where the metric that is used in the SDG process is sort of different measures of hourly earnings for men, women, etc. So let's sort of take a look at where the U.S. is. And this maybe a little hard to read chart gives you a sense of progress on earnings. So the first half of that chart to the left of 1980 shows you productivity growth and also shows you compensation, inflation-adjusted compensation growth. And it shows you those two from kind of the late 1940s to 1980 basically rose in lockstep. I could give you a series of institutional economic arguments about why that happened, but I won't. But basically, the New Deal legislation and unionization that grew up starting in the 1930s and consolidated in the 1950s. That combination of legislation and unionism is what achieved that in tandem growth of compensation and productivity. What you see is a marked departure from those two curves growing together in the right-hand side of the chart. So you see that productivity rate, the darker blue line, has continued to grow, maybe not quite as fast, but still pretty steadily. And you see that in this chart that compensation has grown much more slowly, and so you're looking at less than a third as fast. So U.S. progress on earnings for at least regular workers has not been great. If you unpack that and look at some particular groups, you see even more regression, essentially, things going backwards. So this is the median wage for white, Black, and Hispanic workers since 1979. This is Pennsylvania data. What you see, which actually was sort of surprising to me when we first produced these numbers about 5 or 6 years ago, was in the 80s, the Black wage bounced around, but was sort of 90 to 95% of the white median wage. And then you see a departure between those two, with the Black being still basically flat over time and the white rising somewhat. The Hispanic figure comes in once the number of Hispanics in the Pennsylvania economy grew large enough for reliable estimates, and you see that coming in. It's kind of below the Black wage and then climbing a little bit near the end. So in terms of Blacks, in terms of the ratio now is around 75%, down from that 90 to 95%. Actually, if you look at other states like the Midwest and then you look at southern states, what you find is that Midwestern states, strong union states, strong manufacturing states, you see the patterns very much like Pennsylvania. So it was 90% or higher and has come down. In southern states, it was always 75%. So this is sort of an example of how, at least in certain numbers, Pennsylvania has begun to look more like a southern state. And then you see in this one, it's women's wages since 1979. And again, you see women earning 60 cents on the dollar compared to men. At the median back in 1979, 80 cents on the dollar by about 2000, and just about the same in Pennsylvania in 2021. So the progress hasn't quite stopped at the national level. It pretty much has stopped in Pennsylvania. And okay, just a different slice. Folks know that blue collar workers haven't done very well. A lot of these folks have just a high school degree since 1980, since kind of the decimation of the New Deal and the dramatic weakening of union and sort of industry-wide pattern bargaining and core manufacturing. And so again, warehousing, bounces around, but basically no increase in the inflation-adjusted wage over the last 3+ decades. Trucking, a decline in the first part of the period. If we took these numbers back before 1983, that decline would be greater. Trucking deregulation started about 1980, and so even before this chart starts, truck drivers have taken a hit. Blue-collar construction, again, a little rise, but not much over the 30+ years. Manufacturing, again, a similar story. So basically, these are all manifestations of inequality in the United States, and see us moving backwards in terms of a decent pay. Sorry, whoops. Okay, so now the next slide, sorry for bouncing around, is U.S. progress, or it could be said regress, on labor rights. So this is a familiar story to people who study labor management relations and the labor market in the U.S. But the last time the U.S. strengthened federal private sector labor rights was with the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. That was weakened in 1947 by the Taft-Hartley Act. And then there have been efforts in, I think I'm right in saying, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, didn't even attempt it in the early part of the Obama administration, and haven't yet attempted it in the Biden administration. Basically, in the Senate, you can have 60 votes. You can't get even weak labor law reform through at the federal level. States, conservative states that have about 25% of the population, can prevent any federal effort to enact favorable labor law. So that's one huge issue. Court interpretations and state laws have all become more favorable to employers. 27 states now are right to work states. Again, what that does is it means that workers who aren't members of the union, even though the union represents them and has a duty of fair representation in individual dispute resolution, that nonetheless those folks by law are allowed to free ride. They're allowed to again, get those benefits of the union, but not contribute a penny. The well-funded and determined fight to pass more right to work laws in the U.S., which began in World War II, while our, at that time, mostly men were fighting World War II in conservative southern states. The legislatures were beginning to pass right to work laws. Now, and this depends on, depending on the outcomes of the elections this November, a Pennsylvania right to work law will be likely to pass or not. In 2018, a Supreme Court decision made the U.S. public sector right to work. I mean, basically the anti-union right wing, which focused from 1970, let's say, to 2000 on the private sector union movement, having contributed to the decimation or dramatic weakening of the private sector labor movement the last 20 years. There's sites of those enemies of unions and labor rights have been trained on the public sector, which is now the largest and most best financed part of the union movement. And so they, again, strategically placed a series of court decisions, and this particular decision succeeded in making the U.S. public sector right to work, and therefore depriving public sector unions of financial resources for both collective bargaining, public policy, and not politics, because union dues can't go to politics. Those have to be collected separately from individual workers. Other features of U.S. labor rights picture is U.S. employers can, and this is in stark contrast to Canada and most of Europe. U.S. employers, I think here's one contrast people make, is that in Canada and most of Europe, the decision of workers to choose a union is regarded as workers' choice. It's not employer's choice, it's workers' choice. So one famous labor law professor who was Canadian used to liken it to Canadians in US elections. He sort of said, Canadians have a real interest in the outcome of US elections. It's important to Canadians, but they don't get to vote in US elections. It's none of their business. So from his perspective, that is really the appropriate posture for the law when it comes to labor rights. That's a worker's choice. But the way the US law and court decisions operate, it's very much employers have a lot of influence over that choice. The basic reality is that within the law, employers have lots of advantages in terms of preventing workers from organizing or ever getting a first contract. And if they get to the point that they want to fire union organizers or threaten to shut down a facility, the penalties by and large are a slap on the wrist. So, I mean, one analogy is US union elections are about as fair as Russian political elections. There's been radical reductions over time in the number of union certification elections each year, in win rates and in first contracts achieved. And so it's a numbers game. You lose a certain number of union members every single year because plants close or they lay off some people. So the existing body of union members is every year is some fraction of it is going to disappear. So you need a certain number of new union members even to maintain parity in terms of either the number or the share of workers that belong to unions. And, you know, to the extent that the actual process of forming a union under the National Labor Relations Act has become more and more difficult, with more and more employers and some public sector employers waging anti-union campaigns aggressively. Then you know, unions have tried less and won less and got first contracts less. So that over time gets you to less than 7% in the U.S. private sector. That's the share of workers who now belong to unions. You know, and again, Human Rights Watch, there are international labor standards, freedom of association, freedom to organize and bargain collectively, and Human Rights Watch report of a couple decades ago sort of walked through how U.S. law basically violates basic associational labor standards. So the outcome of the series of changes I just went through in the previous slide is seen here in the bottom red line, U.S. union density. So in the New Deal in the 30s, union density was right around 10% overall in the U.S. It then exploded through a wave of organizing as manufacturing workers kind of figured out by 1935 to 1940 that if they got together, they could get better wages and protection from arbitrary supervision and inhumane work paces. And so they were like, once the penny dropped, that was a realistic option, and you know, happened to General Motors, for example. It spread to other companies. It spread from the auto industry to the steel industry, et cetera. And you know, again, workers said collectively, I'll have me some of that. And so the private sector union density got up above a third, and then the share of workers belonging to unions in the U.S. now is back down to 10%. This is the overall share. The peak in the 50s was almost all private sector unionism, because public sector unionism didn't grow kind of until the late 50s and 60s in the U.S. Anyway, and then the blue line is the share of income in the U.S. going to the top 10%. And basically you see it's basically a mirror image. So as unions get weaker and working people get less of the economic pie, less of a share of the growth in productivity over time, then the top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1% and the top 10% get more of the economic pie. Okay, so now we get to solutions. And again, I think one thing I want to do is just slow down for a second, because I probably made this point, but too quickly. One of the reasons I focus particularly on labor rights, and then secondarily on full employment, which means both full employment, it's like low unemployment rates, and also the way it's defined in the goals, also pay. So that's why I went through the wage figures. But the reason I focus on labor rights in particular is because of its causal relationship to the other measures that were on that like second or third slide. So okay, so again, when we come back now to labor rights and then to full employment in terms of solutions, the central argument here is that that will make progress, on those two goals, but then that'll make progress on all of the other goals under number 8, as well as on many of the other sustainable development goals. So here I'm going to sort of speak in broad terms. The chapter length treatment for the Environmental Law Institute book, goes into a lot of detail on some of the specifics I'll talk through in terms of solutions. Okay, so the first thing on labor rights is to highlight that, the broadest goal of public policy, at least in my view, should be to seed another mass wave of organizing, or if not to seed, to support as it emerges, another wave of mass union organizing, like the one that took place from 1935 to 1955. And I think there's a fair amount of evidence, it's in some of the resources mentioned at the bottom of this slide, but there's a fair amount of evidence that there's at least some chance the union movement could come back. Currently, you can see kind of two streams coming together that could lead to a mass organizing wave and much higher union density. And the two components here are organizing in locally rooted industries. So even though we have a global economy, partly because productivity growth in manufacturing is higher than other sectors, well under 1 in 10 jobs is now in manufacturing. So even though we have a global economy, most jobs are in what I call locally rooted industries. That is, those are industries where you can't serve me coffee in Tijuana. You can't empty the bedpan in my mother-in-law's nursing home in Beijing. You can't give me healthcare, education, in-person retail, in-person higher education. So when you look at all of the industries in the US economy, you actually see that well over half of the jobs are in locally rooted industries. An even bigger share of the moderate and low wage jobs are in locally rooted industries. Does technology like telemedicine and hybrid models of higher education, does it, create some mobility in some formally locally rooted jobs? Yes, but my view is that by and large, the basic reality remains that most of the jobs that aren't very good are in still locally rooted industries, which means critically that if you organize all of the Starbucks in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, you can then negotiate a contract for Starbucks in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. You don't have to get the whole country all at once. So you can go one community at a time. And then the other piece of the picture, and again, Starbucks illustrates it, is that we've seen suddenly organizing in Starbucks. You've seen organizing in Amazon a little bit. You've seen some organizing in including in Pittsburgh, in Google. And so, if it suddenly became, there'd be a critical mass of organizing, 15 Pittsburgh and Philadelphia Starbucks have become unionized in the last several months, then because those companies are big, you can get a significant share of the workforce, and also because those companies are all throughout the country, the locally rooted organizing that begins in one of those companies can be transmitted by the corporate structure. And again, this is sort of happened in Starbucks, which started in Buffalo, but then again has seen organizing in a large number of different cities. So that story, and I think, which again is laid out in more detail in the State of Working Pennsylvania and in a chapter in a Temple University book that came out last year. That way, there is a plausible story in which unions can come back. And other pieces of evidence, union support among people generally is now higher than it's been since the 1960s. There was an uptick in the last year in the number of union elections. There are a whole bunch of specific examples of organizing, in the last 10 and 20 years in locally rooted industries. University of Pittsburgh is one, for example, in Pennsylvania. So that's okay. So hold on, going the wrong way here. Okay, so the broad argument is that public policy and public policymakers, including through the bully pulpit, should facilitate that wave of organizing. Sorry. Okay, this chart shows labor union approval rating, and again, it was done before this year's Labor Day Gallup poll is back to 71%. So which this was the 1965 number. So the number now is as high as it's been since 1959. Okay. God, get my curses away. Okay. So in terms of specific solutions, and again, the details are provided in particularly the chapter length work for the Environmental Law Institute. There's a federal piece of legislation called the Protect the Right to Organize Act, which isn't going anywhere at the moment, and actually may not even be strong enough. It's a very good piece of legislation, but from my perspective, the real secret here is a piece of legislation actually designed to give birth to area-wide unionism in locally rooted industries, something that European law is very supportive of sectoral organizing and bargaining, and the U.S. is not. So the PRO Act would help significantly, but something explicitly designed to give birth to the kind of broad-based unionism that is really the answer to inequality in the U.S. would be even better. The reality is, there's always an interplay between organizing and statutory change at the local, state, and federal level. So in the end, what you have to do is you put out the legislation that's needed or you think is needed. You work to advance it, but you also look at it as something to rally around, concretize what could be done, even when you can't get it over the finish line. At the same time, the organizing has to happen, because that's part of what helps you get to elected officials that will pass the statutory changes you need. So the rest of these bullets flow pretty logically from the basic broad strategy. States and localities are preempted in much of the private sector, but they're not completely preempted, certainly in the public sector and in crevices in the private sector, so they can promote broad-based unionism. Other opportunities in terms of unions that are clearly important now. We just passed within the last year a very big federal infrastructure bill, and more recently the climate infrastructure provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. So you can connect labor rights and standards to the distribution of federal monies through those pieces of legislation, and one of the particular ways to do it on construction projects is through something called project labor agreements or responsible contractor policies, both of which enable construction unions to get a larger share of the work created by that kind of public investment. And then the solutions on full employment that include, this is long-term, so establishing a right to employment, establishing a right to training and reemployment supports. We have a Keystone Research Center has a particular proposal for, in the US, again, unemployment insurance is very weak. Plus workers who are unemployed, most workers who are unemployed get little or no support for training that leads to a good new job. There's nothing like, Danish flexicurity, where you get long-term income support and long-term training, plus most of the jobs in most of the economy are unionized. So you put those three things together and unemployment becomes not very traumatic. Unemployed workers calmly navigate to their next decent job. So anyway, one way to move in that direction in the US would be through better funding, training, and reemployment supports. Ultimately, if technology produces this productivity boost that some people think it will, then we could share that in shorter work time, as well as in higher incomes. And then another couple of thoughts that have had a lot of discussion this year, but federal and state government make real a right to employment through public employment, including a revitalized civilian conservation corps. Again, that didn't get into the Inflation Reduction Act, but there were 7 different bills in Congress to bring back something like the New Deal employment creation program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, Roosevelt's tree army. In the current economy, a revitalized corps really could be part of the battle against climate change. And the outdoor workers that would be in that corps would be what I like to call essential workers of climate response. There was also a federal arts project in the 1930s that created lots of employment, as well as a legacy of lots of fantastic art all across the country. And so that artists don't actually have to starve, we could create employment for them at some kind of decent wage. So with that, I'm going to say one more thing and then go to discussion. We really are at a pivotal moment in this country, in terms of this election, and at the state level and in at the national level. Broadly speaking, and the state of work in Pennsylvania talks about it this way. Let me stop sharing. We talk about this policy options as door number 1 and door number 2, but they really are loosely representative of the options that voters are being presented with. One option will build on the fact that the labor market's now very tight. Unemployment's the lowest it's been in a long time. There are far fewer unemployed workers than there are job openings. So individual workers in relationships with employers have leverage that they haven't had in a long time. There is all that organizing going on. So, if policy and policymakers get behind workers individually and collectively, the modest, broadly shared wage growth of the last 7 years, could morph into a more sustained shared prosperity. Again, the union mass movement would have to be sustained, but that's one of the options. With things like minimum wage laws or laws to raise other workers' wages, also part of the formula interacting with organizing. But then the other very real possibility, the Federal Reserve right now is stepping on the brake. The last month of data show the labor market tightening. There is a scenario in which the election results in federal policymakers who are committed to austerity and trying to ensure that President Biden or whoever runs for Democrats in 2024 is not elected. You could get a repeat of the kind of cuts in spending that we got in Pennsylvania that cost something like 30,000 teachers their jobs. So the choices that are going to be made are, in terms of policies, are going to be decisive in terms of whether or not the recent trends and the emergence from the pandemic recession, whether that turns into another New Deal, or whether that, turns into more years of wage stagnation and inequality. And with that, let's have a conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for the excellent presentation and just super informative on the Sustainable Development Goal number 8. I'm getting feedback, but we'll now stop the recording and then open it up for questions. And hopefully we have a lively discussion here. So hang on for 1 second.